Rabbi around the world, and thank you for your company once again on truth2u.org. That's truth number 2 letter u.org. Joining me is the Director of Education and Counselling for Jews for Judaism in Canada. The website is jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Welcome back to the program, Rabbi Michael Skobac.
Shalom, Jono, and welcome back from the Holy Land.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you so much. It's been a few weeks since we last recorded. Tonight we're doing Psalm chapter 9, but we've taken a little bit of a break because, yes, you went to the Holy Land, and then I went to the Holy Land, and I had an incredible time. I'm so
curious to hear how it went.
Well, it was. I mean, it had everything in it. We traveled from. We went right up north, right up into the Golan, in fact. And
did you wave to Hezbollah?
We waved to Hezbollah. We waved to the Syrian army as well. In fact, you know what? We went to the Valley of Tears. It was an amazing experience up there. You know what? One place that we went that we hadn't been before as well. I mean, the Valley of Tears was one such place. Another one was the Nimrod's fortress. Amazing structure. So we got to see a lot of things that we didn't see on previous tours. Another one, which was just amazing, Michael, was we made it to Hebron. I've never been there before. We were very blessed to be able to meet up with David Wilder, who...
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. And he took us around. We only had a few hours, and we could have really done with maybe 6 hours. I'm sure he would have kept us very, very busy, but it was an amazing experience to be there in Hebron. Not far from there, we also dropped in at Susia. That was a new place as well. I'd never been there.
It sounds like this year's tour was different than last year. And so, people should not think that you're doing the same thing every year and why bother going.
Well, that's exactly right.
Come back again and again.
Yeah, no, it's so true because the tour before, or the year before, this tour had something like 70% of the people on this tour were from the previous tour. So we had to mix it up. And that's the great thing about Israel is that there are so many options, so many things to do that are high on the list, locations to visit, and biblically speaking, biblically relevant destinations. There's just so many to choose from that you can mix it up, and it'll be different every time. This coming tour will be different again, and because it's the I'm gonna let a cat out of the bag, but it will be the 100th year anniversary of the Australian Light Horse Brigade charge, a successful, victorious charge to liberate Beersheba, which eventually opened the door to the surrender of the Ottomans only days later. So
I did not know that the Aussies liberated Beersheba.
It was the Aussies. It absolutely was.
I did not know.
It's I don't know why we don't fly that flag more often. We're kind of consumed with stories such as terrible defeats like Gallipoli. That sort kind of we let that define our military struggles and challenges and achievements. But really, I really do think it should be World War I. It should be what we were able to do in Beersheba, because not since Alexander the Great had an army and cavalry of that size moved through the desert successfully and did what we did. So it's an amazing story. We're going to be there next year on the day for the 100th year anniversary commemorations, official commemorations. So I'm really excited about that, and therefore it's going to be very, very different. The kickoff of next year's tour. But look, I loved it. It was great.
That's awesome.
It really awesome. Is. It's a major part of Israel's history, and I really want to put that back on the map and make that known. So I'm looking forward to that. But it was great, seeing people that I haven't seen for a while, and going around with Tovia. It was really good and a wonderful group of people. It's always wonderful to be back in the land, and it was sad to leave. I can't wait until I go back next year. And so we would love to have people join us, of course. You can go to truth2u.org and click on Israel Tour 2017, and you can get the details there. We would love to have you join us next year.
And it's not too early to sign up?
It's not actually. You know what? There's an early bird discount. So if you sign up before 2017, you get 5% off. So look for the details on the webpage, truth2u.org, truth2u.org. We would love to have you join us. Oh, my goodness. So eventful.
Wow.
But
that was probably just a taste of what happened.
It was just a taste of what happened. There was some amazing experiences. It was great to get to places like Shiloh. It was wonderful to visit familiar places in Jerusalem, the old city. You know what? We went back to the Temple Mount Sifting Project, and I thought for sure I was going to be famous because I found a pearl. I uncovered a pearl I'm not kidding, out of the Temple Mount material we were sifting through, and I was there with Tovia, and we found it, and we were all in awe, and we thought, oh, for sure, this is going to make the newspapers. And I went over to the archaeologist, and I said, check it out. And he looked at it, and he said, yep, made of plastic.
A pearl of not great price.
It was totally counterfeit, certainly not ancient. That was an interesting experience. Another interesting experience was being at the wall at the hotel, praying and having a pigeon leave a little present on my kippah.
It's good luck.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. Okay.
Anyway.
You've been to the Holy Land.
Been to the Holy Land. It was just great stuff. Now, look, we are continuing look, we might not even get through let's see how we go, chapter 9, but we're continuing in our series exploring the book of Psalms, chapter by chapter, and asking the questions, who composed the psalm? What is it about, and what was happening in the life of the author at the time of the composition? How does it apply to us today? Also, when applicable, what would Christianity have us believe about each psalm? How does that deviate from the original intent? Now, right off the bat, Rabbi Skobac, oi. Now, there is some opinion that perhaps chapter 9 and chapter 10 belong together. There's no way that we're going to do that. We may not even get through chapter 9 altogether in this episode, because it starts like this. And when it comes to Christianity, at least in my New King James Study Bible, there's really no connection made. There's no real cross-references, nothing of substance. But I'm surprised because it starts like this. It says, to the chief musician, to the tune of, quote, Death of the Sun, a psalm of David.
That's a happy tune.
Oh, it's a happy tune. Now look,
the tune is called The Death of the Sun.
Well, this is at least what this translation would suggest, and I would have thought right there that Christianity would have jumped upon this and made the most out of it, but it doesn't seem to be so. And is it because the translation "Death of a Son" is definitive, or maybe it's not? Can you right there? Let's jump into that.
Well, I mean, I think it's obvious that first of all, there is, as we'll get into tonight, a tremendous problems translating this first verse. And if we go with that translation, right, that either that the tune itself is called Death of the Sun, or it's I can easily read it in Hebrew. This is for the chief musician, for the conductor, regarding or about the death of the sun, the death of the sun. So it doesn't have to be a tune that's called that, but it could be that this is a psalm given to the conductor for or regarding about the death of the sun. So you could see how Christians would be drawn to this. I think the problem, though, is that the rest of the psalm doesn't seem to bear out any connection to the Christian messianic concept. So it would sort of, it's like, it reminds me of Psalm 30, where it begins by saying it's a psalm, dedicated to the dedication of the temple. It's a song for the dedication of the temple, and then you read the whole psalm. There's not one word about having anything to do with the temple. And so, you wonder, like, what's going on here? Why is this, psalm called the dedication of the temple? There's no follow-through. And so, and when we get to Psalm 30, hopefully in a few weeks, we'll discuss that. It's a fascinating question, but I think that here that would present the same kind of difficulty, meaning that if this is seen as a psalm about the death of the Son, referring to the Son of God from a Christian point of view, the rest of the psalm, 20 verses, further
doesn't give you a lot of material to work with.
Doesn't substantiate or corroborate that kind of reading. So that's probably why they just remain silent in terms of this.
And they do. They really, really do. I mean, I've got my study notes in front of me. I've got the cross-references, and for the most part, really, there's nothing there. But that's the way it begins. Verse 2, I will praise you, O Lord, with my whole heart. I will tell of all your marvelous works. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing praise to your name, O Most High. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Okay.
I'm not going to. The translation here, for the most part, is pretty straightforward.
Okay, we're happy with that.
I say for the most part. We'll get back to the problem.
Verse 4, when my enemies turn back, they shall fall and perish at your presence. You have maintained my right and my cause. You sat on the throne judging righteousness. You have rebuked the nations. You have destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. Michael?
Like your Christian commentaries, I'll be silent at this point.
Okay, so far we're doing well. Verse 7. Yeah. O enemy, destructions are finished forever. I've got an exclamation mark there. O enemy, destructions are finished forever, and you have destroyed cities. Even their memory is perished, but the Lord shall endure forever. He has prepared his throne for judgment. He shall judge the world in righteousness, and he shall administer judgment for the peoples in uprightness. Pausing. We're still good?
Your reading is gorgeous. Keep on going.
All right. The Lord will also be a refuge for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble, and those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. Sing praises to the Lord who dwells in Zion. Declare his deeds among the people. When he avenges blood, he remembers them. That's interesting, isn't it? When he avenges blood, he remembers them. He does not forget the cry of the humble. Have mercy on me, O Lord. Consider my trouble for those who hate me. You who lift me up from the gates of death, that I may tell of all your praise in the gates of the daughter of Zion. I will rejoice in your salvation. I'm going to keep going. It says, the nations have sunk down in a pit which they made, in a net which they hid, and their own foot is caught. The Lord is known by the judgment he executes. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. And then it has this curious little word here, which is higeon, I think is the way it's pronounced. The translation that I have here is meditation. It's just a word that stands alone, and it says Selah. The wicked shall be turned, now get this, Michael, the wicked shall be turned into hell, is what I've got.
Oh boy.
In the Christian translation, and all the nations that forget God. And this is also curious, for the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, do not let men prevail. Let the nations be judged in your sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. Selah. There it is.
That's a beautiful reading, and as I was following in, I have a Jewish translation called A Time of Favor, which is by Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Iskowitz. It's not that different, and I think the general content of this psalm, when you read it, it doesn't seem that mysterious, really. It seems for the most part to be talking about thanking God for his saving us, rescuing us, thanking God for his wonders, thanking God for the destruction of our enemies, for the saving of Israel. That all these basically testify to God's justice, that God works to deliver those who know his name. What else goes on here? That there's an assurance that the poor and the oppressed will, in the end, be rescued. That ultimately the wicked are going to be taken care of. And that there'll be a future salvation as well. More or less, that's what's going on here. You can have slight deviations between the translations, but it seems pretty straightforward. That's although it's 21 verses, that's more or less what's happening here.
Well, that's a pretty quick program.
Yeah, and so
we're done.
It doesn't seem to be too mysterious.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.
See you later, folks. So that it really does. I think people could easily read this psalm and not get too bothered by what's going on, especially again if you're lulled into a false sense of security by the translations, which that's what happens whenever you're translating from any language to another language. But I'm sensitive to the translation of the Hebrew into English here. The Hebrew is very rich and often mysterious. And so you may have material in the original Hebrew that is very complex, very rich, very mysterious. And ultimately, the translator has to choose a word or a phrase. And, by doing that, they diffuse all of the tension in the actual original text because they're resolving the tension. They're resolving the difficulties in favor of one possible resolution, one possible translation. And really, the original may have a whole plethora of, possible translations that, the translator has to struggle with. So, if you're just using a translation here, you could very easily be lulled into a sense that this is a simple psalm. There have been a number of approaches to what's going on here. One approach is that this psalm was intended to be really a prayer that either was actually said historically at a time when people were facing trouble, and it was intended to be used in the future. Meaning, David was writing this psalm as a prayer that people would say when they were about to face tremendous difficulties, let's say a battle or someone attacking them. And so the psalm was basically a prayer, expressing hope that they would be delivered. And that's the general theme of the psalm according to that point of view. The other point of view would be that no, it was not intended to be a prayer that was said in anticipation of difficulties, but it would be a prayer that was meant to be recited after the deliverance, meaning after we've been delivered from an attack, from a battle, from a war, from persecution, then we would thank God in this psalm. This is a psalm thanking God for rescuing us. Probably a better approach would be that in fact both are going on in a sense, that the prayer is said. It's a psalm that's ultimately supposed to be a thanksgiving psalm, thanking God for a deliverance, thanking God for a salvation that has occurred, but at the same time realizing that this is not the end of our troubles, and that in the face of future difficulties, it's a prayer, requesting and asking that God save us in the future as well. Now, the $64,000 question. Oh, just before I get into that, you mentioned, and it's a good point, that some commentaries say that this psalm was really supposed to be connected to the 10th psalm, and actually the Septuagint has them connected, and I think some other versions as well. One reason is that if you read it in Hebrew, you'll see that there seems to be some kind of alphabetical acrostic where some of the verses, begin with the first letter of the alphabet, and then and that doesn't continue all the way through in chapter 9, and so it seems that it looks like it possibly connects to chapter 10. Another reason is that almost all the Psalms have a superscription, sort of an introduction to the Psalm. And it's interesting that many Christian versions of the book of Psalms don't count that superscription as a verse itself.
As a verse. Yeah, that's right.
Right? And that's why there is a difference in the pagintation between Jewish and Christian versions of the Psalms. So many Psalms, most have that kind of a superscription, like a Psalm of David, a Song of David, to the conductor on a certain instrument. Psalm 10 is the only one between Psalm 3 and Psalm 32 without a superscription. And so some people suggest that it really came as a follow-through, as a conclusion of verse 9, chapter 9. But, most people do not see that, as compelling. So really, and I hope I'm not going to drive you or anyone else crazy with this analysis, but the real, and it's hard to really do this, without access to the Hebrew. I'll try and make it as user-friendly as possible. But the problem is the first verse here, or the superscription. Everything else really in the psalm is pretty straightforward, and there's not much difficulty,
Right, but taking those the overviews that you gave us, how then is it related to the death of a son?
Well, and that's the problem, meaning that it may not even be talking about the death of a son. The first word here in Hebrew is pretty straightforward. Lamnatseach means to the conductor. Now, the next two words are the problem words in Hebrew. And the third word, labain, that means to the son, to a son or to the son. Could be either one. Although, as we know, things are never that simple. And the more difficult word is the previous word, al-mut. Okay, now, what's the problem? The problem is that traditional Jewish sources are not clear whether this is one or two words. Because we do see places in the scriptures where it is clearly written as one word. And so some people read this as lamnatseach, to the conductor, and then almut, let's say for argument's sake, we'll keep it at that, whatever that means, labain, and then to the son, or to a son, and then mizmor LaDavid, a song, a psalm of David. These words themselves are just, first of all, they're hard to translate. What does it mean? Let's say it means, let's take it at the simplest level. Al mut, regarding or on the death of a son, a song to David. So the question would be, what son is it referring to? Who is it referring to? And then, if it's referring to a son, what does that have to do with all this, attacks and fighting and war and Thanksgiving? What's going on here? And if it reads as one word, almut, it's not clear even how you read it. What does that mean? And the word labain itself, Hebrew is sort of flexible, and it's very close to the word in terms of the consonants here of lavan, of white. Now, let's just back up for a second and just recapitulate what the previous word might mean. Almut has a number of possible directions it can go. First of all, it's related to the word olam, which means world or eternity or forever. It's related to the word elaim, which means youth or a young person. So all of these possible words get tossed into the mix by the commentaries, and I'm going to try to summarize some of the suggestions that are offered in the traditional commentaries. Some of them seem very far-fetched, and we don't have to take them that seriously in terms of our program. But I'd like to try to at least run with one or two of them. And it's really what makes this psalm so incredibly complex. One thing, is very interesting. People who study the Bible, the Tanakh with the classical Jewish commentaries know that the go-to commentary is always Rashi. Rashi, written about 1,000 years ago in France. And, he wrote a commentary to the entire Bible, basically. And he's very terse. He's very, he tries very hard to give you the simple meaning of the text. What's fascinating here is that Rashi juggles and throws out at least 7 different possible interpretations of this. Now, that's very, very, very unusual. I mean, just for Rashi to suggest 2 possibilities or 3, it makes you wonder, well, what's wrong with that one? What's wrong with, right? If he has to suggest a second interpretation, what's wrong with the first possibility? But to have 7 possible interpretations, you see one thing. You see that Rashi was really struggling with this. And aside from the 7 possible approaches of Rashi, there are a whole bunch more that are suggested by other people. So if you think it's all right,
please.
I'll try to very, very quickly run through these and explain maybe a little bit about where they're coming from. So, and not in any particular order, but Rashi first deals with the possibility that this is speaking about the death of a son, and he tries to identify who this son might be, and he suggests that it's speaking about the death of Avshalom. Now,
and look,
again,
that's the first thought that came to my head when I read the psalm, and I went back and I had a look at the opening of the psalm, and I thought, well, if I have to put 2 and 2 together, the first thing that comes to my mind is Absalom. But when I'm looking in the study Bibles that I just had in front of me, nowhere is this mentioned, and I thought, well, that's curious. But please continue.
Well, again, one of the problems would be, I think, as we pointed out with the possibility that it's talking about Jesus, I mean, where is the follow-through here? Meaning that it doesn't sound like the rest of the psalm is dealing with the death of Avshalom. It sounds like it's primarily focusing on, either David's, conflicts and wars with enemies, and it doesn't sound like it's speaking about, the conflicts with his son. It seems to be foreign enemies, and it seems to be. What's interesting is that the text switches over from an individual's struggle with enemies. It's clearly talking about a national fight. So it doesn't. It seems hard.
Yeah.
Right. It would seem hard to say that the whole context of this psalm is focusing. It's a psalm that's dealing with the death of Avshalom. There's another approach that's offered, not by Rashi, by the way, by others, that it's dealing with the death of his infant son that was born to Bathsheba.
Right.
After he had his affair with Bathsheba, so God, told him that one of the possible outcomes and is going to be that he's going to lose the son. It's going to be the product of this relationship, and that son actually dies, I think, after 7 days. And it throws David into tremendous mourning. And there's an approach which takes this possibility very seriously. I believe it's the Alshich who takes this approach that this is, and he manages to interpret, and that's what you have to do, by the way. If any person that suggests any of these, potential, people that this is referring to, is going to have to sort of reconstruct the whole psalm in terms of that identity. So, so the people that want to go with the Avshalom, option, they're going to have to somehow take every verse and show how it connects to Avshalom. I'm not going to do that now. The Alshich does that with, taking this psalm as focusing on the death of David's infant baby, this little infant that dies. Rashi's second option is very weird. I mean, it's very, very weird. He himself rejects it quickly. He says that Lavan here, Laben, the son or a son, if you read it backwards, it sounds like something, from the Beatles. You're going to play it backwards. And what does it sound like? If you take the Laben backwards, he says it spells out Naval. And
who was the husband of Abigail.
Abigail, yeah. And David and he didn't hit it off. But again, it seems far-fetched. Why would this psalm hide his name in that kind of a way? And again, it's hard to squeeze him into the whole narrative here. Now, Rashi does bring up another way of reading this word al-mut. And, he says that you can read it as one word, as al-mut, dealing with youthfulness. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to get back to what that would mean in the context of the whole psalm.
Okay.
Another option that Rashi suggests, and this is close to the way he really will end up reading the psalm, is that the whole psalm is really somehow dedicated to the eradication of Esav and Amalek in the history of the Jewish people. And he actually finds interesting textual clues in this psalm for this approach. He doesn't really ultimately go with it, but he goes with something very similar. And his approach basically is fifth of the seven, is that this psalm speaks, he says, of the future. It's a psalm that's really speaking about the future when he says childhood and youth, the childhood and youthfulness of Israel, like the immaturity, the childhood, the youthfulness of Israel, and that's based upon the second word here, to the conductor almus, right, from the word youthfulness, childishness. He says will mature and will turn white. That's the third word. Laben, he reads as lavan. So he reads the first three words as lamatseach, to the conductor, almut, youthfulness, lavan, becomes white. Now that's a reading which I don't think any non-Jewish translation is going to have in 5 million years. But you can easily defend it by these words. So Rashi says that what's happening in this psalm is that when the childhood of Israel is going to mature, meaning in the future, and what does it mean mature? So mature is white, meaning that the youthfulness will turn white, the white of old age. And what will happen in the future is that the righteousness of Israel is going to be revealed at that time, and salvation will ultimately come with the destruction of Israel's implacable historical enemies like Esav, Edom, and Amalek. So he says that that's what's going on in this psalm.
So initially that sounds rather obscure, but what you're saying is that it's permissible, at least Rashi thought so and was persuaded by it, it's permissible in Hebrew.
Well, for two reasons. I think that what's compelling for Rashi is two things. Number one, the Hebrew words here, again, are so obscure and difficult to translate. The simple ones that often translations jump to, like about the death of a son, well, it's not so simple that it means that, because it's not clear whether the word al-mut is one word or two words. Because again, we have places in the scripture where it's clearly one word. And it could be one word here as well. And laben, could be read as lavan. And then what Rashi, I think, is drawn to is that the context of this psalm, which speaks about the overcoming of enemies and the praising of God, and God ultimately being lifted up in praise, he sees that as ultimately something which is speaking about the historical future of the redemption of Israel and the spreading of the knowledge of God to the entire world. The ultimate redemption of Israel, the fact that Israel is going to be, will become righteous in the future. I mean, all the themes of the Bible that come up clearly elsewhere, Rashi sees connected to this chapter, and he actually finds many many textual clues in the psalm itself. For example, it speaks about God's throne becoming completed, and there's a verse in Exodus which speaks about God's throne not being completed until the downfall of Amalek, which is from Esav. I mean, there are many things which draw Rashi to this reading of the psalm. But wait, there's more. And what I find puzzling is that instead of stopping there, meaning you think that he would stop once he hit, the sweet note, the sweet spot, he goes on and he says that the word laben sounds like the word lahavin, which in Hebrew means to understand or to comprehend. And so he suggests that one way of reading Lamnatseach Almut Lavan is that it's very interesting that if you go to Psalm 46, verse 1, there you have an instrument that's called, actually, the instrument is called Alamot. It's actually called Alamot. And so he says that this is the to the choir master, to the conductor, Alamot, which means on this instrument called the Alamot, Lavein, in order to cause understanding, meaning he's saying that this is part of the introduction to the psalm, that it was given to the conductor on this particular instrument in order to help others understand the theme of the psalm. So certainly a plausible reading. Actually, it's very neat and it's tidy. And then finally, Rashi, his last suggestion, and again, why does he throw this in at the end? He says, this is to the choir master, Lamnatseach, the first word, Almot, regarding the death, which is, again, the way most Christians, I think, take this psalm, Almot, about the death. And he says it's about the death, not of Laban, the son, but a person who's named Laban.
Oh.
He says there was a king, that this king's name was Laban, and so this is a song about the death of this implacable foe of David named Laban. Right. And he says that the only problem with this explanation is that you don't find this name anywhere else in the Tanakh, meaning that who is this
that makes it hard.
enemy? But he says that to defend this, he says that the truth is there are many, many people whose names you only find once in the Tanakh. So he says it's not so strange, and this would be the one place his name appears. And then again, what it has going for it is that it does seem to be that in this psalm, David is speaking about, again, the problem with speaking about the death of Avshalom, or the death, especially the death of his infant son, is that it doesn't seem that for the next 20 verses, David is concerned with fighting against them. But he does seem to be fighting against some, implacable foe that's causing, an existential threat to his, kingship, and especially to the survival of the Jewish people. And so the idea that there was this horrible tyrant named Laban that was, causing grief to him and the people of Israel, and the rest of the psalm describes how he overcomes this threat, and we have to praise God for that. So it's not so crazy. It's not the nuttiest idea.
That's perhaps one of the easier approaches. I would have thought it's very. We can tuck that one away and continue reading, and it doesn't require too much bending of the mind to make it work.
No, not too much gymnastics there, and too much twisting. Now, one of the I think most compelling readings of this chapter, and you'll find this in a lot of the Jewish approaches to this psalm. Hold on to your hats. Okay. It's going to sound a little bit stretched, but it actually, there's a lot going for this one. Is that, here again, what is this idea of a psalm about the death, right? Al Mut, we can read as about the death. Laban, right? So again, the previous idea was that it's a person named Laban. We've had other people saying, it means about a son. We had already the idea that it can refer to the idea of binah, understanding, that it's a psalm that was supposed to help us understand certain things. But two of the greatest commentaries, and actually other people mention this as well, but the main proponent of this is someone named the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi. Actually, he was a great polemicist against Christians in the Middle Ages. He says that the best reading of this psalm is that the word Laban here derives from the word in Hebrew, bain. So ben and bain are very similar, and bain means between. And he says that it refers to, believe it or not, Goliath. Why? Because, and it's hard again, you'll never get this from an English translation, but in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 23, Goliath is referred to as Ish HaBeinayim, the man who was between them. Because again, the word Bain means between. So that's the tie-in to the first verse, that this is a psalm about the death of the man who was between, Laban, and they read this as about Goliath. And when you read 1 Samuel 17, there are tremendous parallels to what's going on in the body of Psalm 9, meaning that what happens in Psalm 9 is in 1 Samuel 17 is that David, kills this horrible enemy, but then there is really not just the death of this, this giant, but there's also a national victory over the Philistines. The Philistine army flees. So you see that going on in Psalm 9. You see that it seems to be speaking about, one person's fight, and then there are verses that seem to be speaking about a national battle.
I can see the parallel between the story of David and Goliath and Psalm 9, but it is difficult to accept what seems to be a stretch. And did you say it was 1 Samuel 17, verse 23?
Yes.
It says, so at least in the English, then as he talked with them, David's talking with his brothers, I think, there was a champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, Goliath, coming up from the armies of the Philistines, and he spoke according to the same words, so David heard them.
Right, so it's a hard word, it's a hard verse to translate, but the Hebrew is Ish HaBeinayim, and literally it means the man between them, meaning that there was, he was between the Jewish people and the Philistine army.
Right, and he was, okay. Yeah,
but many translations don't render that phrase like that. So even in I have, let's say, I'm going through the Art Scroll Stone Tanakh.
Yep.
So they render that passage in the following way. They have it as he was speaking to them, behold, the champion went forth from the Philistine battalions. And I think they're rendering the word the Ish Beinayim as the champion. So I don't know if it's a sort of vague and difficult a phrase to translate. But the Radak is taking it as this idea of being between. And the beginning of Psalm 9 speaks about the death of Laban. And Laban, again, we don't know what it means. Does it mean the sun? Does it mean white? Does it mean, a person with that name? Or does it mean to understand? Or Radak is saying, no, it's sort of hinting at, and again, this is not a clear reference, but I think, again, in the same way that Rashi sort of has a vague way, a sort of almost a forced way of reading the introduction to this psalm, I think what drives him is his sense that that's what's going on in the psalm, that it's a sort of messianic psalm that is, dealing with the future redemption of Israel. And I think the Radak basically says the same thing, that the context of this psalm, he sees tremendous parallels to 1 Samuel 17, where, it's not just, defeating Goliath and the Philistines, but there's sort of this, debate, this back and forth between David and Goliath, where David says, you've come upon us, you come up against us with, swords and spears and weapons, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts. And so that comes out very clearly in Psalm 9, where the victory is, in the name of the Lord. And, the singer of this psalm doesn't just leave it as a victory against our enemies, but it's very clear that, there has to be an acknowledgement of where the victory is coming from. We give thanks to God. We're not taking, refuge in our own might and our own strength. And so David here in this psalm, he praises God and he thanks God for his victory and the nation's victory. And then what's interesting is that what happens in the psalm ultimately is that the psalm moves on from there. There is the beginning of the psalm is really focusing on these victories against foes and enemies and dangers. But then David really sort of shifts to be looking towards, what about the life of the ordinary Jew, the impoverished Jew, the poor Jew, the humble Jew, the simple people that, their struggle is not against these massive armies. They may be struggling to, buy food for their family, or they may be struggling to, somehow just make it in life. And so David speaks about the fact that God will be there for them as well. And, so he sort of, the psalm, and many psalms will do this, many passages in the Bible do this, they have sort of a primary focus, and then the focus sort of shifts to something else. And so David really says that God dwells not just on the battlefield, but God dwells among the people of Israel. He dwells in Zion. And he concludes, the whole psalm concludes with a prayer against future enemies who think of themselves as more than they really are, right? I mean, you have Goliath, who sees himself as a superhuman, right? And he probably, not only did he think of himself as large physically, he probably thought of himself as larger than life, and maybe even having some divinity. So David says at the end of the psalm, look, you future enemies, you think you're hot stuff. You think you're bigger than, you really are. God will show you that at the end you're just a frail human being. You're just flesh and bones. And so there are commentaries that try to, find. And again, if we had more time, we can go through each verse of the psalm and show how, these commentaries will try to find the textual clues in each verse to their particular approach to understanding the psalm. I mentioned already before the Alshich, who takes this as the death of David's infant son. There are some more obscure approaches. One of these sees, I think I might have mentioned this already. I mentioned this, that it's talking about the psalm being played on an instrument, or the psalm will be on a particular melody that's called alamos. You find this, I mentioned Psalm 46:1, but it's also in 1 Chronicles 15:20, this particular instrument or a particular tune. If I could, I'd like to share what I find to be maybe not the most compelling, but the most beautiful approach to the psalm.
Please.
And it's from Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So he was German. I think he lived in the 19th century. And he takes off on the idea, I mentioned this before, that the word al-mut, which is that mysterious word in the superscription or in the first verse, it's really related etymologically to the word olamit. Olam is world or eternal. And so what Hirsch basically says is that this is a psalm dealing with eternal ideas. And he says it's an eternal psalm dedicated to the Son. But for Hirsch, the Son is God's Son, Israel. Right? We see in the scripture in Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, Israel is God's son, his firstborn. So Hirsch suggests that this is a psalm dealing with eternal ideas, and it's dedicated to the son, Laben, which is Israel, and Israel's special relationship with God. And what he does is very interesting. He sort of makes a goulash of all the other interpretations, and he says all of them are right. He says because these are just all examples of our difficulties and our foes and our enemies, and so all of the suggestions.
So it's a multi-allegorical approach.
Yeah, he sort of says, you know what, you're all right. It's not one or the other, because he says that ultimately, our history has been one of struggle. So whether it's against Esau, whether it's against Amalek, whether it's against Goliath, whether it's against this unknown enemy called Laban, whether it's against internal enemies like Avshalom, whether it's against, Naval, whoever it's against, these are eternal battles, and ultimately what the psalm says is that God will judge them. And what Hirsch says is that Israel will ultimately survive eternally, because he says Israel is al-mut. Literally, it means over death or above death.
Right, okay.
Meaning that because Israel, he says, lives in both worlds. And again, he takes the word al-mut here as olamot, worlds.
Now that's interesting. I have another translation that says over the death of the sun. Mm-hmm.
So he's using this. I mean, he's sort of fluid and almost he's almost musical with the way he puts this together, and he says that what's being spoken of here is that we have these throughout our history, these ongoing battles and these implacable foes, but ultimately he says Israel will survive eternally, which again is the word olam, eternally. And he says, because he takes it almost as a triple entendre, because we are al-mut, which means over death. And he goes further, not just al-mut, but olamot, worlds in the plural, because we live in both worlds, both in this world and the next world. Mm-hmm. And he says that furthermore, another sort of take on the same word, he says, so therefore Israel maintains al-mut, again from the word elem, which means youthfulness. He says Israel maintains sort of an eternal youthfulness and vigor. Why? Because we are God's son and God's young son. And one last thing he says, and with this I will shut up.
You're right.
He says that al-mut has another meaning, which I didn't even mention yet. The word elem, I mean, it's interesting that, in Christian worlds, the famous passage in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, Hine ha'alma hara, yep. The alma, the young girl, will be pregnant or is pregnant, and it's translated, as a virgin in Christian circles. But the word alma really is related to the word la'alem, which means to conceal or to be hidden. Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is that, a young girl, her sexual history is hidden. You don't see it. You don't know about a young girl's, you can't tell by looking at her. So what Hirsch says here is that the word al-mut is related to the word la'alem, which means concealed or secret. And he says that God is ultimately behind the scenes of world history, meaning that there's a concealed hand, a hidden hand that moves history, that moves what's happening throughout history, making sure that Israel will overcome all odds and ultimately survive. So Hirsch basically takes almost everything we've said previously, he rolls it all together in one, I think, beautiful package. And, he sees this similarly to Rashi, that it's it's a historical psalm that really looks towards the future, and it looks towards the sweep of Jewish history in terms of looking at the ongoing history of Israel, in terms of our struggles. Ultimately, all will work out, and he somehow weaves in all the different, or almost all the different interpretations of what these words might mean. Mm-hmm. But again, if you didn't have those first three words or first four words in this psalm, it looks pretty straightforward and simple. And when you struggle with trying to untangle what actually is meant by these words al-mut laben, you can you can use a nice vacation after you struggle with this,
and then it becomes a Rubik's cube.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Now, with that aside, though, Michael, there are just a curious handful of points. Can I just ask you a couple of questions in regards?
Yeah. I probably won't know the answer, but
verse 17, I just found it really curious because I don't know that we see a structure like this very often, if at all. The Lord is known by the judgment he executes. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. And then we have a standalone word. Do you have a comment there?
You mean Selah?
No,
reflect on this. Reflect on this.
Reflect on this. Okay.
Yeah. Higayon. Meditation. Reflect on this. Think about this. It's interesting, by the way, because the word Selah itself, according to many commentaries, is a word indicating that there's a pause here, and you should think about this. So it's almost redundant to have Higayon and then Selah. You don't need both. So it's interesting.
Two pauses together make a longer pause, but but it's interesting because is this? But the other thing that I'm curious about, and just off the top of your head, does something like this appear often, if at all, elsewhere in the Psalms?
You mean this kind of double usage of those concepts of reflection and Selah?
I mean the standalone of Higayon.
I don't recall offhand.
Off the top of my head, I think it's. I don't know that it's an anomaly, but I can't think of another place where it's used like
common.
This. And therefore, I thought it was curious. But what
I find curious is not just the word higayon, but that it's followed up by a very similar word, Selah. And the question would be, why exactly do we have to ponder this? I mean, I think that look. We often don't see how, the plans of the wicked will, at the end, do them in. Most often in life, we see the wicked succeeding. And that's why, one of the themes that comes up in some of the Psalms is, the question of why the wicked seem to prosper. And so we often see wicked people running rampant in the world and, and fulfilling their wicked designs. And so here it's saying that, no, you know what? They're going to really ultimately fall into the traps that they've made. And so it may be saying, think about this. And maybe if you meditate, you might be able to actually see that this is actually what happens. But it requires some thought and some real discernment, because we don't see it readily.
But after that meditation, that consideration, the point is made very bluntly in the following verse 18, that basically, at least in the English, the wicked can go to hell, is what David's saying. But obviously in the Hebrew, they shall be turned to Sheol.
The truth is that when you go through the entire Tanakh, you have a whole slew of words that are used for both death and for the afterlife, the pit, and there are a whole bunch of words, and it's not, I would say, 100% clear if it's referring simply to death or if it's referring to the afterlife in some way. But I think what's interesting is that verse 17, as we pointed out, as you mentioned, sort of puts a big question mark on how the world, is judged, meaning that it is saying, God sort of it's stating that God does execute judgment, and through the way he runs the world, and the wicked will be entrapped. Think about this, because you won't probably see it so easily. But then after that big question mark, David writes in very, very clear terms, this is what's going to happen to these guys. You might have to think about it, but the scripture here, the revelation, coming through the Holy Spirit of God, is telling us this is what's going to happen. So you might have your own difficulties, sort of squaring up the fate of the wicked, because in this world you don't always see it happening. But David is saying, rest assured, they're going to get their just deserts.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say, for the needy shall not always be forgotten, the expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. And I suppose that's the expectation of justice.
And salvation, right? That they will be taken care of, that there'll be some, justice, that, they suffered for so long. It's almost the flip side of the previous verses, that, the wicked seem to get a free ride, and they seem to be running rampant in the world, and we're told that they are going to get their just deserts. And so verse 19 is saying that those people who've been afflicted and persecuted, maybe they will see some light in their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, there it is. Goodness. Is there anything else that you'd like to highlight before we wrap up?
Well, you know what? It would be great to be able to go through all 20 verses and show why each of the commentaries, is able to read their approach into the actual text, but it would take us way, way too long. So I think it's just enough for the listeners to be aware, just alerted to the fact that, this is what the commentaries will do. I mean, that they're not just asserting, an interpretation at the beginning of the psalm. They are careful commentaries. They're careful readers of the Bible, and they are able to somehow carry their proposal all the way through in each verse. Now, when you go through them, some of them will be more compelling than others. Some of them will seem like they're stretching the verse to fit their interpretation. Mm-hmm. But they each have, an approach which has something that, seems to have something to say for it. And at the end of the day, the fact that you have so many different interpretations, this to me is always, one of the most difficult but beautiful parts of the Tanakh. You have so many places where we're not just on clear ground. It's interesting that in the famous story of Moses hitting the rock, the commentaries there struggle tremendously to figure out what did he do that was wrong. It seems simple on the surface, and yet, there are at least a dozen different, very, very compelling interpretations. And, the question at the end of the day is, something must not be clear here if brilliant minds are able to see this story so differently. And, the same thing here, that the fact that you have the first three words of this psalm that are really just so pregnant with potential meaning, and so murky in terms of its being a difficult, mysterious, complicated phrase that just it does lend itself to so many different possible interpretations. That's why in some ways this psalm is just so incredibly difficult. But I hope that we shed some light on it.
What you've done is you've put forth to the listeners the options of adopting a particular perspective and then applying that as they read through the psalm, and they can do that for all of those possibilities if they so desire. So that's very valuable, and so in fact the vast majority of those perspectives I was unaware of, and so I look forward to reading back through it again. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for doing that. We're going to continue next week in Psalm chapter 10.
God willing. Next week or the week after.
Or the week after.
One of these weeks.
Rabbi Michael Skobac of Jews for Judaism in Canada. That's the website jewsforjudaism.ca. That's jewsforjudaism.ca. Thank you, my friend. And in the meantime, dear listeners, be blessed, be set apart by the truth of our Father's word. Shalom.